April 23, 1945, New York Harbor. The fog lifted like a theater curtain revealing something impossible. 12-year-old Karl-Heinz Schneider stood at the railing of the Liberty ship, salt crusted on his borrowed coat. He watched towers of glass and steel rise from the Atlantic like monuments from another world. Behind him, 300 German prisoners shifted nervously on the deck. Before them, America waited unburned, unbombed, impossibly whole. If you're watching from anywhere across the globe, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. This is history that deserves to be remembered. The engines cut to idle, the ship groaned against its moorings. And in that moment, staring at a skyline that propaganda had promised lay in ruins, Karl realized everything he'd been told was a lie. They had expected chains. They received apples instead. Karl had volunteered for the Volkssturm 3 months earlier in Hamburg. He was barely tall enough to hold a Panzerfaust. When the British tanks rolled through his district, he'd thrown down the launcher and raised his hands before ever pulling the trigger. The corporal who zip-tied his wrists spoke no German but handed him a chocolate bar anyway. That was the first reversal. There would be many more. The Atlantic crossing took 19 days aboard a converted cargo vessel. Below deck, the air tasted of diesel and unwashed wool. Karl slept on a canvas hammock strung between pipes, listening to older men argue about what awaited them. Some predicted labor camps in frozen wilderness. Others whispered about revenge about American mothers who'd lost sons demanding blood. A Luftwaffe mechanic named Werner claimed the whole war was orchestrated by Jewish bankers. Karl stopped listening after the third day. What he noticed instead were the small mercies. Hot soup twice daily, no beatings. Medical inspections where American doctors actually wrote down symptoms instead of waving men away. One evening, a sailor distributed wool blankets without being asked. Karl wrapped his around his shoulders and cried silently into the rough fabric. He was too young to articulate why kindness hurt more than cruelty, but he felt it. By 1945, the United States held over 425,000 German POWs across more than 500 camps scattered from Texas to Montana. The logistics were staggering. Every prisoner required 2,500 calories daily per Geneva Convention standards. That meant 32 million meals per month. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps moved men like freight, but freight wrapped in international law and supervised by Red Cross inspectors who documented everything. America was fighting 2 wars, one against fascism, one against becoming what it fought. Karl knew none of these numbers. He only knew that when the ship's engines finally went silent and the cargo doors clanged open, sunlight poured down the stairwell like something holy. Guards in pressed khaki uniforms gestured them upward. No dogs. No shouting. Just the patient wave of a hand toward the gangway. The pier smelled of creosote and engine grease. Longshoremen paused their work to watch the prisoners file down in ragged columns. Karl expected jeers or thrown rocks. Instead, he saw a woman in a Red Cross uniform holding 2 wicker baskets. As each man passed, she handed him an apple bright red, polished, impossibly perfect. Karl took his with trembling fingers. He turned it over twice before slipping it into his coat pocket, convinced someone would snatch it back. Across the dock, a row of olive green buses idled with their doors open. Painted stencils read U.S. Army Transport POW. The seats inside were upholstered. There were windows without bars. A sergeant stood by the first bus holding a clipboard, checking names against a manifest with the bored efficiency of a train conductor. When Karl's turn came, the man glanced at his age, frowned, then waved him aboard without comment. The bus smelled of leather and disinfectant. Karl chose a seat near the back and pressed his face to the glass. As the convoy rolled north through Manhattan, he watched a city untouched by war scroll past. Neon signs advertised Coca-Cola and Lucky Strike. Women in bright dresses waited at crosswalks. A boy his age rode a bicycle with playing cards clipped to the spokes, grinning at nothing. Karl's chest tightened. This wasn't the shattered enemy his teachers had described. This was abundance made visible. Camp Shanks, New York, 30 miles north of the city. The convoy arrived at dusk under a sky streaked violet and gold. The camp sprawled across rolling farmland, 200 wooden barracks arranged in precise grids, each painted the same dull green. Guard towers stood at each corner, but the searchlights weren't lit. Floodlights illuminated a central yard where men played volleyball using a net strung between posts. Laughter drifted across the fence, real laughter. Karl had forgotten what that sounded like. Processing took 2 hours. They were photographed, deloused, issued new clothing, gray work shirts and trousers stamped with the letters POW in black paint. A medical officer checked Carl's teeth and lungs, then marked him fit for light duty. No one asked his rank because he'd never had one. The intake clerk wrote "Auxiliary Volunteer" on his card and filed it without ceremony. Dinner was served at long tables in a mess hall that seated 500, meatloaf with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread with butter. Carl ate until his stomach cramped, then kept eating. Across the table, Werner stared at his tray in silence. Finally, he said, "This is what they feed prisoners?" No one answered. The food spoke for itself. By June 1945, the United States was producing 45% of the world's manufactured goods, despite having only 6% of the global population. American factories built one new aircraft every 5 minutes. A Liberty ship left the docks every 3 days. The average U.S. soldier consumed 4,000 calories daily, more than most German civilians saw in a week. This wasn't propaganda, it was arithmetic. And it showed in every meal, every uniform, every truck that never ran out of fuel. Carl's barracks held 60 men on steel-framed bunks with cotton mattresses. A potbelly stove stood in the center. Shelves held donated books, novels in German, English textbooks, even a few technical manuals. The first night, he lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of safety. No air raid sirens. No distant artillery. Just the rustle of pages turning and the soft murmur of men writing letters they hoped might reach home. Work began at dawn. Carl was assigned to the camp garden, a half-acre plot where prisoners grew tomatoes, lettuce, and squash under the supervision of a farmer from Iowa named Corporal Janssen. The man spoke broken German and gestured constantly, his hands stained green from pulling weeds. He showed Carl how to tie tomato vines to stakes, how to check soil moisture by touch. When Carl worked too fast and uprooted a seedling by mistake, Janssen simply replanted it and said, "Langsam. Slow down, kid." The routine became ritual. Morning roll call at 6, breakfast at 7, work until noon. Lunch, then more work until 4. Evenings were unstructured time for classes, sports, or quiet. The camp offered English lessons twice weekly in the recreation hall. Carl attended every session, mouthing unfamiliar words until his tongue ached. The teacher, a school teacher from Pennsylvania, corrected his pronunciation gently. "Thank you," Carl practiced. "Please excuse me." By midsummer, he could hold simple conversations with the guards. They taught him baseball slang and card games. He taught them how to swear in German, which they found endlessly amusing. One afternoon, a guard named Private Hayes showed him photographs of his family, a farmhouse in Ohio, a younger brother in uniform, a dog named Rusty. Carl stared at the images, trying to reconcile the enemy he'd been trained to hate with the man pointing proudly at a vegetable garden that looked exactly like his own. The paradox gnawed at him. In Hamburg, soldiers had been abstractions, helmets, and rifles marching in newsreels. Here they were men who hummed songs while mopping floors, who complained about the heat, who asked about his mother. They were utterly, devastatingly human. Sundays brought the sharpest contrasts. Local church groups were allowed to visit under supervision, bringing donated clothing and books. One afternoon, a Lutheran pastor from Albany stood at the fence and led prayers in German. Carl joined reluctantly, reciting words he'd learned before the war made language feel dangerous. Afterward, the pastor handed out hymnals through the wire. Carl took one and found a note tucked inside, handwritten in careful script. "You are not forgotten. You are not hated. May God grant you peace." He never learned who wrote it. News from Europe arrived in fragments. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Berlin lay in ruins. The camps, the real camps, the ones with smokestacks, had been liberated and photographed. Images circulated through the barracks in contraband newspapers. Men who had denied the rumors went silent. Werner burned his photographs of Hitler in the stove one night without explanation. Carl didn't know how to process guilt he hadn't earned. He'd been a child playing soldier, but he'd worn the uniform. He'd believed the lies. Now he sat in a camp where his captors fed him better than his own government ever had, and he couldn't reconcile the two realities. August 1945. The war in the Pacific ended with 2 flashes of light that redrew the boundaries of possible violence. In the camp, the announcement came over loudspeakers during evening assembly. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Prisoners stood in formation, uncertain how to react. No cheers, no celebrations. Just the quiet settling of men who realized they had outlived the cause they'd been told to die for. Repatriation would take months. Germany was a smoking ruin divided between occupiers. There were no jobs, no homes, no infrastructure. The Red Cross advised prisoners to remain in U.S. custody until conditions improved. Most agreed. Werner joked bitterly that they were safer as prisoners than as free men. No one laughed, but no one disagreed. Karl's English improved rapidly. By autumn, he was helping translate for new arrivals, older men captured in the final weeks, who stepped off buses expecting brutality and found order instead. He watched their faces cycle through confusion, suspicion, and finally reluctant relief. He recognized the pattern because he'd lived it. One morning, Corporal Janssen asked Karl if he wanted to help with the fall harvest on a nearby farm. A dozen prisoners would spend 3 weeks picking apples under guard. The pay was 80 cents per day and camp scrip enough for cigarettes or candy bars from the canteen. Karl agreed immediately. Not for the money, but for the chance to see beyond the fence. The farm belonged to a widow named Mrs. Callahan. Her sons were overseas, one in France, one in the Pacific. She needed hands to bring in the crop before frost. When the truck arrived at her property, she stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching the prisoners file out. Karl couldn't read her expression. It was hard as stone. They worked in silence the first day. Filling bushel baskets under a pale September sun, Mrs. Callahan watched from a distance, never approaching. At noon, she brought out sandwiches and lemonade, setting them on a table without a word. The men ate quickly, unsure if kindness was offered or grudgingly given. On the third day, Karl climbed too high in a tree and the branch snapped. He fell 8 feet, landing hard on his shoulder. Pain shot down his arm. Before the guard could react, Mrs. Callahan was there, helping him sit up, checking for breaks. Her hands were firm but gentle. "You're all right," she said quietly. "Just bruised." She brought ice wrapped in cloth and made him rest in the shade. That evening, as they loaded the truck to return to camp, she approached Karl directly. She held out a small paper bag. Inside were 3 apples and a folded piece of paper. He opened it later in his bunk. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "My son is somewhere far from home. I hope someone is kind to him too." Karl folded the note and placed it in the same pocket where he'd kept the first apple from the dock. He never threw it away. Winter came early that year. Snow covered the camp by November, muffling the world in white silence. Repatriation began in January 1946. Names were called in alphabetical order. Men packed the few belongings they'd accumulated: books, letters, photographs of American landscapes they wanted to remember. The camp emptied in waves, each bus carrying another load toward the docks and the long voyage back to a country that no longer existed in the form they'd left. Karl's turn came in March. He was 15 now, taller, his voice finally deepening. The boy who'd gripped the railing in terror was gone. In his place stood someone quieter, more uncertain, but not broken. The night before departure, Corporal Janssen found him in the garden. They stood together in the cold, breath fogging the air. "You're a good kid, Karl," Janssen said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." He handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a gardening manual and a packet of tomato seeds. "For when you get home." The bus ride to the docks felt shorter this time. Manhattan looked the same, bright, bustling, indifferent to the cargo of prisoners passing through. Karl pressed his face to the window one last time, memorizing the skyline. The ship waiting in the harbor was another Liberty vessel. Karl climbed the gangway with his duffel slung over one shoulder. As the moorings released and the engines rumbled to life, he stood at the railing and watched America recede into the gray Atlantic haze. He thought about the apples, the lemonade, the note from a mother he'd never see again. He thought about men who could have been cruel and chose patience instead. About a system that treated enemies like human beings because cruelty would have cost something more valuable than victory. It would have cost principle. Germany was a different place when he returned. Hamburg was rubble and improvised shelters. His mother had survived, but barely. She wept when she saw him, touching his face as if to confirm he was real. He gave her the gardening manual and told her about the camp, the farm, the guard who taught him English. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. "Did they hurt you?" she finally asked. "No," Karl said. "They didn't." She nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something she hadn't wanted to believe. Karl-Heinz Schneider never spoke publicly about his time as a prisoner of war. He became a schoolteacher, taught English and history, and tended a small garden behind his apartment until his death in 2003. Among his belongings, his daughter found a shoebox containing a faded Red Cross form, a gardening manual with an Iowa address written inside the cover, and a brittle piece of paper that read, "I hope someone is kind to him too." By war's end, over 375,000 German POWs had passed through American camps. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, but the United States exceeded those standards not because it was easy, but because it was deliberate. Mercy, they understood, was not weakness, it was proof that civilization could survive its own violence. Karl's story is one among thousands, but it carries a truth that transcends dates and statistics. He arrived expecting punishment and received patience. He braced for hatred and found humanity. And somewhere in that reversal, a boy raised on propaganda learned that the enemy was not the nation across the ocean, it was the lie that said cruelty was ever necessary. In the years after his release, Karl rarely spoke of the war. What he did speak of quietly, almost cautiously, were the small moments that had stayed with him. A guard who shared a cigarette without ceremony, a farmer who let the prisoners eat apples from the edge of his field, a camp chaplain who insisted that every man deserved to be looked in the eye. They were gestures so ordinary that they could have dissolved in memory. But for Karl, they were proof that the world he had been taught to fear was not the one he met. The fog lifts, the towers rise. But it is not only the scene of his first surrender that returns to him, it is the understanding that followed. He would later tell his children that the strangest part of captivity was not the confinement but the kindness. How disarming it was to be treated as if he were still capable of decency. How unsettling it felt to realize that his captors believed something about him that he had not believed about himself. Years turned into decades. Karl became a teacher, then a headmaster, then the old man who knew every student's name. He kept no souvenirs of his service except a single photograph, a group of thin, weary prisoners standing in front of a camp library they had built themselves, books stacked unevenly on rough wooden planks. Knowledge, he would say, tapping the picture, was the first freedom we earned. When we refuse to answer violence with more violence. It is not an easy question. There is no neat, comforting answer. There is only the weight of choice, the daily, relentless choice to respond to cruelty with patience, to meet fear with understanding, to offer a hand instead of a fist. In that space, in that pause between action and reaction, something extraordinary can happen. Something almost imperceptible at first, like a single candle flickering against a long night. Karl never found the words to fully explain it. He never wrote a manifesto, never delivered a grand speech. He did not insist on recognition or gratitude. Yet for 50 years he lived as if the question itself were the answer. He spent decades teaching others how to ask it, how to confront the echo of violence, not with retaliation but with thoughtfulness, with empathy, with courage. In classrooms, in quiet conversations, in letters and in small acts he planted the seeds of reflection. And in those seeds, lives changed, sometimes only the weight of choice, the daily, relentless choice to respond to cruelty with patience, to meet fear with understanding, to offer a hand instead of a fist. In that space, in that pause between action and reaction, something extraordinary can happen. Something almost imperceptible at first, like a single candle flickering against a long night. Karl never found the words to fully explain it. He never wrote a manifesto, never delivered a grand speech. He did not insist on recognition or gratitude. Yet for 50 years he lived as if the question itself were the answer. He spent decades teaching others how to ask it, how to confront the echo of violence, not with retaliation but with thoughtfulness, with empathy, with courage. In classrooms, in quiet conversations, in letters and in small acts he planted the seeds of reflection. And in those seeds, lives changed, sometimes subtly, sometimes in ways that could never be measured. He showed that refusing to perpetuate harm does not erase pain, but it reframes it. It carves a narrow path through the chaos, a place where humanity can still be recognized, even in the darkest times. And in that recognition, there is a kind of defiance, a declaration that the human spirit is not bound by cruelty alone. Karl may never have spoken the words history demands, but through a lifetime of small, deliberate choices, he ensured that the question would live on and that generations would continue to ask it.